Fighting Blindness Canada's Viewpoint is a virtual education series that brings you the latest in vision research presented by health experts from across Canada. The webinar you're about to watch is a recording. To learn more about the research we fund and upcoming webinars and events, please visit our website at fightingblindness.ca. This Viewpoint webinar is proudly presented by Bayer and supported by Abbvie, Apellis, Beacon Therapeutics, Janssen, MeriaGTx, Novartis and Roche. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this webinar and share your thoughts with us in the comment section below.
So we want to welcome Dr. Cynthia Qian, who is joining us from Montreal. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I just want to introduce Dr. Qian. She is an associate professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at the University of Montreal. She is the chief of the Retina Service and program director for the Retina Fellowship Program. Dr. Qian completed medical school at McGill University, residency at the University of Montreal, and fellowships in surgical retina and inherited retinal disease at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary at Harvard Medical School and the Kellogg Eye Center, University of Michigan, respectively. She is also the vice president of the Canadian Retina Society, among other affiliations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Larissa and FBC, for inviting me to this first in-person viewpoint for me since many years. And I'm really happy and excited to be with everyone here today to be able to converse and take your questions in person. And hopefully we can have some very interesting dialogue and discussions. Great. So I work out of Quebec, and I'm sure every province is slightly different, and the setup, the way that in which people are able to access their eye health professional and then get the clinical visit and testing is different. Usually how it works for myself and for colleagues that I work with who do see retinitis pigmentosa amongst other inherited retinal diseases is very often I'll get a referral from either an optometrist or a primary eye care physician, an ophthalmologist, or another retina specialist who has been seeing them for either a very short period of time or for some time. So I would say there's two categories. Either the patients who are, as I mentioned in the first question, who have just found out that they might have something inherited and they're coming to see me as a first or second visit. And then there's also the people who've been told that they've had a diagnosis for many, many years. And now that the landscape is slightly changing and things are advancing, they're coming to see me as a second referral after having been followed by their primary eye care physician for sometimes for yearly follow-ups for 10, 15, or 20 years. And usually, I would say more commonly than not, most of these patients, of the people I meet or the patients, haven't had a full workup of their eye tests for a long time. So I do try to do at least a new baseline when I first meet them to make sure that we have all the testing using the latest information and the latest equipment, which would involve taking pictures, getting the functional testing, which is getting the electrophysiology testing, the ones that, when you have electrodes on around your eyes and taking sort of as flashes of light are shown, kind of taking the electrical signal measurements, recordings of the eyes. We also do the visual field testing and the genetic testing if that's something that's not done and that the person is interested in knowing about. And based on that, then we go forward with the discussion of what and everybody's understanding levels and what their outlook or expectations are different. So that's a very meaty part of the encounter is based with all the appropriate or the most amount of information we have, trying to discuss going forward what to do in terms of next steps and how we're going to continue the follow-up.
And I know there's going to be, I'm sure, a lot of questions about treatments. I was wondering, as a starting point, if we could maybe just discuss some of the main types of treatments that are either available or being studied for inherited retinal diseases.
So for a long time, as many of you know, a lot of the treatments which are helpful are of the supportive nature. So being registered with your local eye vision rehab centers and being able to get regular checkups and regular testing with either optometrists or general ophthalmologists in a setting that has experience working with different types of IRDs. And then more recently, there have been, as you follow with FBC, many exciting news, both in the research realm, but as well as in the approved, Health Canada approved gene therapy realm. So my connection with treating IRDs actually started also a couple of years ago when, as you know, the first foray into treatment was using optoelectronics, or people who had the retinal prosthesis installed, which would basically in that scenario, it was a treatment that did not take into account necessarily the exact genetic nature or the genetic mutation of the patient. All that was needed was that a patient either has lost a lot of vision but had a prior usage of that vision and basically was able to use their visual memory to stimulate vision back again using the electronic component of this device. This was a very different approach, and the group of people who were willing and interested in that usually were in the most advanced stages of IRDs, meaning that they had either lost almost all of their vision or had completely lost vision, and it was a way of getting some vision back and be able to better navigate using motion and contrast and kind of contours. And so that was in practice in Canada, basically mostly in Ontario and in Quebec for several years until the company that was producing these sort of slowly phased out, and they're looking at a different model, which is the subcortical implant to directly stimulate the visual cortex of the brain to see. So we're still kind of waiting to see what those developments or research are leading to. And then in the meantime, what has really taken up in the field and that we're actively working with, and even all through Canada, all the specialists working with FBC and through the different universities, is the application of the gene therapy approach, which is really first and foremost, what's really had grown exponentially since that time over the past few years. And that really started with the first gene therapy that was approved to treat and reverse the effects of an IRD, which, as many of you know, is the Leber's congenital amaurosis disease type 2, caused by a mutation in the gene that's called RP65. And that one has been approved historically in the US in 2017. And we saw that being applied, meaning that it was out of the research realm. It was approved to be safe, deemed for both safe for children and adults to receive through a surgical intervention, which would inject the healthy gene that was delivered in a liquid viral vector. And then from 2017, as patients began to get treated in the US, this treatment was also applied for use here in Canada, with the approval arriving in 2020. So 3 years after the US approval, this is when the Canadian approval arrived. And then from there, of course, there's a question about deploying it at a provincial level and about coverage by the governments to be able to cover the cost of this treatment so that it becomes accessible for all those who are eligible, so that obviously no one is paying out of pocket, and also getting the infrastructure in place to be able to apply this treatment. So that's really been the building up of this first revolutionary vision-changing gene therapy. And since then, I would say the field has really continued to expand at a very rapid speed, and different diseases, other IRDs with more complex pathologies, different mechanisms are being looked at to see whether those would also be good candidates for the same type of gene therapy. And many of those are undergoing different phases of research and clinical trials. And so that's the major part of gene therapy, but there are also other ways that are looking at modifying genes and correcting the genetic mutation through different approaches approaches, and I'm sure many of you have read about the possibilities of working with RNA instead of DNA, and also techniques such as antisense oligonucleotides, as well as optogenetics. So all of these are looking at how to edit or change the genetic mutation in different ways in order to hopefully generate a lasting and permanent correction in the mutation that induces vision change and loss.
So I think, is it true that this is the microphone that is, okay, that we can hear with for the video? So we're trying to tape the session so that people who weren't able to join today can hear it. So I'm now going to open it up to questions. I will bring the microphone to you, and then I'll probably bring it back to Cynthia. I know it's a little bit awkward, but just so that everybody can hear it well. So I'm going to start here at the front, and then I'll work my way back. So over here.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I had a question. Are they still doing research on stem cells?
Hi, Lisa. Great question. So yes, there's still research being done on stem cells. As you mentioned, there's different ways of approaching the application of how to restore or rescue cells that are slowly either losing function over time or that are not at 100% in terms of function. The research with the stem cells, I would say, is still in a clinical trial level because of the complexities of basically being able to create complex layers of cells that would be then able to work all together, and then also the idea of being able to transfer those cells into a living eye or retina and have that sort of adopt the new environment, being able to continue to function. So a lot of the research is very active, is looking at single layers of cells, for example, photoreceptors or retinal pigment epithelium. But obviously, as we know, in complex eye diseases, once one layer, for example, the photoreceptors begin to lose function, it can, first of all, it can start in the rods and it can affect the cones. So it's a very intricate interaction between different types of cells. And up till now, it's very hard to generate a model where you can have different types of cells all sort of being able to work beautifully in the complex layers and intricacies, and then physically implanting that into an environment where it might have to adapt and be able to thrive for the long run. So I would say a lot of research is looking also at, for example, just cone cells, for example, in conditions where mostly it's just a monolayer of cells that are malfunctioning. And the idea is perhaps with time and knowledge, it's going to build up into being able to maneuver more complex multi-layers of cells and how that would live in the in vivo in the human retina or body.
And we actually had our last viewpoint, which was a couple of weeks ago in September. It was a webinar, which is available online. We had a researcher, Dr. David Gam, who is a researcher from the United States that Fighting Blindness Canada is funding, and he is studying stem cell therapy and is at the preclinical stage. So if anybody's interested in learning more, I encourage you to watch that webinar on our website.
Can gene therapy help people with Stargardts, and what exactly is the procedure?
Thank you for the question. So the question is about Stargardt disease and whether gene therapy can function. Yes, theoretically, and in many types of diseases, the idea is, of course, there's a translation between the theoretical into the applied and the real life, but the short answer is yes. The difficulty is, of course, developing a model and testing it, making sure it's safe in animal models, and then moving on to the human trials. I would say of all different conditions, Stargardt is one of the more commonly studied one because it's one of the more common inherited retinal diseases. As we know, it involves starts oftentimes, again, it's a complex disease which can affect different people even in the same family differently. You know, some people in the same family can have very late or almost no presentation of it, and they can have siblings or other members that are severely affected much more earlier on. And there are different approaches that are looking at how to either treat or slow down the effects of Stargardt disease. And we've seen that there are not only gene therapy approaches, which would be, in that case, try to change the genetic mutation, most often in the ABCA4 gene, but there are also approaches looking at ways, whether simpler ways, ways that don't involve necessarily a surgery or an injection into the eye, such as oral treatments, could potentially slow down the buildup of the toxins that we knew can accumulate in Stargardt disease and cause degeneration of the retina. So there are both gene therapy approaches looking at Stargardt, but there are also ways where they're looking at something that would be perhaps just oral pill that you would take at home, or perhaps something just a injection into the eye, not necessarily a surgery with an injection that involves going to the operating room.
Hi, thank you for talking to us today. My name is Harsha. It's funny you mentioned ABCA4 because that what my question is about. So I have RP, and my gene defect specifically is ABCA4. Do you know of any, I know that no drugs have been approved for that, but do you know of any clinical trials or gene therapies or anything of that sort for that gene specifically? That's my first question. And second questioning, having said that, if you do you know if they happen to be safe in terms of like physically, like it won't cause any adverse reactions to the, like, the rest of you or like the rest of the person, not just the eye?
Thank you. That was a perfect segue about Stargardt and moving into the gene. So that's a great follow-up. So as we were saying, as you can see, the gene is can produce very, very varied presentations. Someone can have Stargardt disease, and then others can present with a much more all-involving diffuse retinal, or a manifestation where more of the retina rather than just the central retina is affected. So there are quite a few trials that are going on for the treatment of ABCA4 and some of the other most commonly found inherited retinal diseases. I would say it's because of the nature of the way clinical trials are structured. Oftentimes, for physicians, for example, when people come to me and say, "I've read about this study, should I go?" Like oftentimes it's a study that's in the United States or it's overseas, and they come and they say, "I've read about it. It looks very exciting and promising. Should I just travel overseas and go there for 6 months and participate in this trial?" I think this is something that a lot of people have in mind. Like, is it worth it? Is it worth my the effort of doing that? And oftentimes I will say, well, let's sit down and look at that trial, because a lot of these are oftentimes they're listed on clinicaltrials.gov or other websites providing the information. And obviously I do like to do that exercise of sitting together and look at it, because I would say the quality of the different studies can vary greatly. Just as a study coming out of a very well-known researcher who works in this field over 25 years can post a study. Someone who's just started a new company and is maybe they're not necessarily the experts in the field, but they know of the potential interest and boom in the field, could also set up a study like that. So I think it's important to kind of sit together and look at these studies together and see whether they hold all the criteria for a good study. For example, whether it comes from a reputable university or academic center with someone who's had experience performing these kind of researches, or if they've had experience doing the preclinical and then the early phase 1 trials. So I would say it's really a case by case. I have had patients, for example, that I see that did travel, for example, overseas to meet with researchers who are starting certain trials and studies. And obviously the ones, for example, for us Canadians, the ones that are accessible by land through, for example, continental US are much more accessible than something that's overseas. And I've had patients who have joined studies, but of course it's something that needs to be discussed with the investigator, and also how feasible in terms of what the requirements are, whether it's a surgical intervention with follow-ups every day or every couple of weeks or month. So I think it's something that can be envisioned, and some of these studies do accept Canadian or non-American participants. But I think first and foremost is to really look at the study in detail and see whether it's a valid one.
Thank you. I think there's a question right up here.
Hello, my name is Inam Naqvi, and I have two daughters that have Bardet-Biedl syndrome, number 12, BBS 12. So I want to know what is the hope for that stem cell therapy, and how much time it will take.
Thank you. So the question is about Bardet-Biedl BBS 12 and that you have in your family with your two daughters. So as you know, there are studies that are looking at Bardet-Biedl. Because it's a syndrome, there are many aspects that can be affected, including eyes, but a lot of the Bardet-Biedl can also affect the endocrine system. So a lot of people are also followed by an endocrinologist, and sometimes by I don't know how old they are, if they're if they're adults or younger adults, right? So oftentimes, when we see the children with Bardet-Biedl as children, they have quite extensive testing with the pediatrician, because as we know, it can affect multiple systems. So in these conditions, as you said, which are syndromic, oftentimes they do have to look at different systems or different organ systems separately, because ideally you would want one treatment that would take care of all the different health problems that can be generated. But for the time being, they're looking at different parts of the Bardet-Biedl presentation separately, and eye being one of them. I know that a lot of advancement has been made in the endocrinology sector for Bardet-Biedl, notably that people can now go, there's trials where people can take pills for their endocrine unbalance. So people who, some of them have some changes with appetite and weight control, and that's something that's been looked at really extensively with Bardet-Biedl. In terms of the eye, it's more at a more investigational or research level. So even as you mentioned it, in the same condition disease, different organ systems, the research can progress at different rates. So I would say probably the endocrinology treatments are coming up faster as the eye research continues.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the optogenetics, because I heard that is coming up in the States soon, I think. And I had two questions: when and where, and also are they going to be taking into consideration when they do start up here? Will they be talking to people in France who have already started and are on phase 2 about what the best dosages are and things like that?
Great. Thank you for the question. So we're shifting directions a little bit about optogenetics. So for those who are perhaps not familiar with optogenetics, we've been talking a lot about gene therapy. Just as a brief background, optogenetics is, I would say, I had defined the gene therapy and then what came before, which was the electronic version of vision, where people would use eyeglasses paired with electronic, like a chip inside the eye to see better. So optogenetic, in a simplified way, kind of falls between those two things. It's not quite that, but I think just to kind of give a definition, is because basically you are delivering through a viral vector, once again, photosensitive vectors, which will make people who've lost vision sense light again. But it's basically the product that's injected is completely it's a non-human. Actually, the earlier ones come from the algae, so it's a non-human version of a of a photosensitive molecule or ion channel, and you're pairing that with basically a pair of glasses that can amplify light sources from the outside world. So you're, again, wearing a type of recording glasses, and it's recording your environment outside, and then the glasses amplify that signal so that then the injected vector that's inside your eye can detect this heightened level of light, and then you can once again sense motion and the environment around you. And it's different from gene therapy as we've defined, in the sense that in this case you're basically bypassing the photoreceptors or the retinal pigment epithelium, which is usually the first cells that are being affected or damaged by IRDs, and you're trying to render other healthier cells, such as the ganglion cells or the bipolar cells, you're making them become the cells that are able to sense light. So it's really a fascinating, very innovative approach, and as you can see, there are different types of complementary ways in which the research and the technology is trying to help people regain vision. And I would say that is it's not restoring vision by giving back function to cells, the usual cells that do their usual visual cycle steps. It's really creating new cells that are going to detect light in a different way. And so there's been some very exciting research and pretty more advanced phase 2 and coming out of both France and also from the US in Pittsburgh, which is where Dr. Sahel is based. So this is the main center, and Dr. Sahel is a retina specialist who also specializes in IRDs, who works both in Europe and the United States, and the research results that they've shown are very promising. I would say it's most likely, yes, the question is they're coming. When is hard to answer, because for sure it will have to be most likely FDA approved and European approved. Those countries will get the approvals first, because that's where the studies had the first patient recruitment and results before it comes to Canada.
But the trials, when will the trials start?
So the trials oftentimes is based on when if they have preliminary positive results, they will reach out, because oftentimes how it works is when we see positive results, obviously as Canadian physicians, we want to get that to our patients as fast as possible, but the company that produces the product must decide that they want to expand into the country before we can actually get it. So it's not simply about, for example, a group of Canadian retina specialists saying, wow, we see these wonderful results, we want to have that come to Canada. There's a lot of, I would say, behind the scenes, there's a lot of governmental and infrastructural hurdles that need to be crossed by the producing company. They must be willing to ramp up the production and bring it to a different country before we can start looking at the research studies and perhaps approval.
Like Pittsburgh's close. Especially we live in Niagara. Very close. So we could actually go to Pittsburgh. So is that possible then to apply at Pittsburgh and go out of country to get into a trial?
That's a great question. So I think I think it depends on each province. I would say I have definitely sent some of my Quebec patients to sites where clinical trials were happening to have the families meet with the lead researchers and investigators, and at that point it's basically a decision about whether the person fulfills the criteria to participate in a trial and whether they're willing to basically do this, because at that point, again, I'm not a specialist for Niagara or Ontario, because there's a question about coverage, right? I think oftentimes for the research, the medication and the procedures, there is coverage for that, but in terms of the person's frequent displacement to go to that site, living there for that time during which they have to get treatment and follow-up. Every province is different, and because it's in a research context, it's not a approved treatment that's only available in the US. Because it's a research context, each province covers differently. So I've had people from Quebec who've gone because there was a trial for their gene and their coverage was not covered because it was deemed research and not approved treatment.
And I have one more question about it, if that's okay. I was wondering, with the goggles, is there a possibility that the goggles would improve at a later date, and so that the vision would become clearer or have more in depth?
I think for sure, in terms of the technical aspects of the cameras and the amplifying systems, because it's hardware, it will definitely improve. Just as any hardware, in terms of what we see in our daily lives, improves. The important thing is just following up, making sure that the company continues to invest and continues to, because I think that's a learning process that we've had through the retinal prosthesis as well. They need to continue maintaining products that they've put out and also have software upgrades and hardware upgrades. I think glasses, in that sense, the advantage is that's easy to upgrade, right? It's an completely external device, and you could just give away the old ones, get a new pair. There's no specific piece of hardware that's necessarily inside the eye. So that's the beauty of it, because you're combining a totally removable piece of hardware with something that's, a permanent one dose in the eye. So I think it's quite elegant.
I'm going to go to the back. Oh, okay.
So hi, Dr. Qian. I work for a biotech company based in the U.S. That's doing a trial for X-linked retinitis pigmentosa. So I just wanted to say, every company is different in terms of bringing patients over to the U.S. from Canada. We are recruiting patients from Canada. We compensate them for that travel, but every company is a little bit different. And I'm happy to talk to anyone here who's interested in learning more. But the other comment I wanted to make is it's very challenging to get a study approved in Canada. We have to get that approved by regulatory authorities, not just the FDA, but every country we go into requires us to go through those steps. So it's not a matter of do we want to go into the country, it's a very long process in Canada. So oftentimes we start them in the US, and then it's 9 months, 12 months later, we may be able to get approved to have that trial in Canada. But in terms of travel, we would compensate for that if it's a clinical trial and pay for that. So just so you know, every company is different, but it's a good question to ask every company where you're considering a clinical trial.
You mentioned for LCA, there is a cure for LCA type RPE65, which is Luxturna. So what are the other types like CRB1? Any drug you see in future for CRB1?
Thank you. Right, so the question is about CRB1, the mutation, right, in terms of treatment, upcoming trials. I think so I have a few patients with CRB1 as well. It's actually, perhaps just because of the patient population, it's among some of the more common ones I see in my practice. In the current time, from my knowledge, there are no treatment research trials for CRB1. There are some natural history trials, and I'm sure the field is large, and there are different varied institutions looking at different genes. But for that one per se, there's no current trials enrolling patients as we speak.
I would just say if people also have questions about very specific genes and trials, there's a few options. So there's a really, really large database called clinicaltrials.gov, which has all the clinical trials, almost all the clinical trials in the world. We also have on the Fighting Blindness Canada website a page specific to clinical trials largely for inherited retinal diseases, which will list out the different trials. And also, if you have specific questions and find it a little bit hard to navigate because it can be a bit complex, we have a health information line where if you either call in or email, we can help look and see if there's any trials available. Yeah, so I'll do these two here.
Hello, Dr. Qian. I have advanced RP caused by the RDH12 gene. So would there be a point that the retinal degeneration, so the retina is, so to the point where the retina is not well enough for any potential treatments, whereas because in my particular case, I lost my functional eyesight by age 20. So all I can see now are just lights and shadows.
Thanks for the question, Billy. So the question is about whether what we call sort of a window period for a lot of the physicians, whether there's a point after which the degeneration is very severe and perhaps is not as able to respond to any treatment or therapies. So I would say for the moment being, again, this is a discussion that we often have together with other physicians all across Canada. We have regular meetings through the FBC as well as amongst ourselves, because we often look at cases of possible, for example, I'm just using the example of Luxturna as an example. We look at the patient, once someone is identified, we look at the selection together as a group. And I would say that because it's very individualized, someone who's quite young, so could be preteen, could have pretty advanced or severe cell loss, and then someone who's older or could be like a more well advanced into adulthood could still have good preservation. So at this point, I would say there's not necessarily a cutoff to say this is the end of such a person's window period after which it's no longer viable or no longer possible. For example, with Luxturna gene therapy, it's based mostly on age. So anyone above the age of 3 or 4 is eligible, and there's no age in terms of cutoff in the sense that after a certain age, it's no longer automatically an exclusion. We do look at the individuals both through testing and on their photos to make sure that they do still have remaining cells that function that can basically take on the therapy. So there's no hard cut age or limit. It really depends on that one person's personal lived visual experience, as well as what we see on the testing, whether we think the eye would be a good receptacle for the treatment. So I think we'd have to basically look at your tests or the pictures to see how the cells look, and in terms of the function, what is recordable. But right now, there's no cutoff saying that after which point people are no longer good candidates for treatment, especially for approved therapy.
Okay, I see 3 hands up, so we're going to answer those 3 questions first, and if we have time, we can get to more. Otherwise, I'm sure Dr. Qian will be around for a little bit to answer other questions during the lunch.
Hi, hello. I was like diagnosed. At first, I was diagnosed with Stargardt when I was young, and I saw a lot of doctors that time. And then, so during that time, I thought I had Stargardt, so I did research on Stargardt. I know there was a couple questions before about Stargardt, because I also lost vision. I was like around 18, 19, a low vision. Time went by, and then I did a genetic test many years later. And then they said I had cone rod dystrophy, because they did the genetic test. So I also did research. During the whole time, I did research on Stargardt, because I thought that's what I had. I saw different doctors, and then I did genetic testing years later, I think in 2020, and then they said I had cone rod dystrophy. I'd like to know, would there be any treatment options, or where would it be, and how long too?
Thank you for the question. And I just want to confirm, so you did get the genetic testing, and that was for the gene... Okay. Okay. All right. So I guess what you're saying brings up a great point, which is that oftentimes in the past, prior to genetic testing, a lot of the diagnoses were made by physicians simply by looking at your eye and saying, well, from my experience, this looks like Stargardt or say something else. So of course, Stargardt does also fall into, it could be a type of cone-rod dystrophy, because cone-rod dystrophy is a broad term, meaning basically that it's a type of IRD which starts by affecting more the cones first, and then the rods secondarily can become affected. So it can encompass different types of conditions with different genes. So it depend on the gene type, finally, in terms of whether treatment is coming, because there's no one necessarily treatment that will treat all cone-rod dystrophies. And sometimes even a condition that starts as a cone-rod dystrophy can also switch to become rod-cone if at some point, for example, cones were affected initially, but then rods become more affected. So these things, the terminology based on what we see on the vision and the functional testing can actually change over time. But I think what we were saying, just coming back to your first point, brings up a good point, is that I think a lot of people who were seen before the genetic testing era were oftentimes misdiagnosed, I think. And I've had those in my practice where people were told, and Stargardt comes up a lot because I feel like it's, as you know, it's one of the common IRDs. So a lot of people get the diagnosis of Stargardt and then later on they're seen and yeah. Like some people I see, like it's a family of 3 generations, and grandfather was told he had Stargardt disease, and then I see the grandson, and well, first of all, they have another condition which is called Best disease, which is a condition that is much, I would say, usually milder in presentation and only affects the center of the vision, and the two look quite different. So the first time I saw a condition like that, I was like, wow, like you've been living 3 generations with another diagnosis that's not yours, and it must be, I can understand it could be frustrating, and oftentimes the evolution of those are very different, and then people end up studying or learning a lot about a disease that wasn't necessarily their own. So I think that just highlights the importance of having right now, as I was pointing out earlier on, having a more comprehensive and full examination with genetic testing if that's available. And that, I think, especially, I don't know if most of the audience here is from Ontario or some from out of province, but I think Ontario actually has quite an advance over certain other provinces, because a lot of the infrastructure has been set up to look for genetic mutations even before sometimes when trials or treatments have come on, because then you have this it's like running, and you have this leeway where you already know your mutation, and that's really helpful knowledge to look for possible research or projects either in Canada or elsewhere, versus some people who learn about that there's now one approved treatment and they're just starting that process of getting tested, and that's a whole lot of a delay until they know what their mutation is and they know what their options are and whether they are candidates. So I think it's really important, especially for those who haven't had genetic testing or who might have access or perhaps haven't done it or are thinking about it. I think it's just very useful knowledge once one knows that they have an IRD, to get the clear genetic confirmation so that they know, even for example for cone-rod, which type of cone-rod dystrophy they have.
I'm actually only going to do one more question because unless people are happy to stay, but I know it's starting to be lunchtime and I hate when talks bleed into lunch. So I'm going to do it here. MeriaGTx, I'm so sorry. I saw your hand up.
Okay. Good morning. My name is David. Oh, that's okay. I don't really need that. Thank you for taking my question. I just wondering, can you give the audience maybe an update of where we are with gene therapy or stem cell therapy clinical trials with also an X-linked eye condition called choroideremia? Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So the question is about an update about the overview of what's perhaps the most advanced in terms of the gene therapies, what's most likely to come first to be available both in Canada and worldwide. So I would say there there are several studies. The main ones that are being studied right now, and which are probably the ones that are going to come to Canada and other populations first, do include choroideremia. There are quite a few studies that have looked at different approaches of gene therapy viral vectors for choroideremia. There's also a lot of interest for diseases such as RPGR or X-linked retinitis pigmentosa and Stargardt, as well as Usher. So I would say if we just look at a list of the most active fields where gene therapy trials or different approaches of gene therapy are being looked at for different pathologies, those are often the ones that are the most commonly seen, that they've already gone through phase 1 and 2, and phase 3 is either upcoming or ongoing. Chromatopsia is another one of those conditions. So those are the ones that have had the most different studies in the field, and you see that there are different companies that are looking at the same disease model through slightly different approaches or different molecules. So I think if anything, because those have already produced positive results, those are the ones that are most likely to be the ones to come up next in terms of possible approval and coming to Canada.
Okay, so I am going to, I think, cut it off for questions now because I know we have lunch, but Dr. Qian is going to be here all afternoon, so thank you.